Thank you, Chair Moore, and thank you, Vice Chair Brown and members of the committee. I appreciate your time. I apologize to you that I didn't get this to you in advance, but I do want to do this with PowerPoint. I think pictures will be very helpful in explaining what I want to try and convey. So my task was to share with you a view of why labor matters in this equation. So I'm going to go through some of the institutional forces that have shaped Black earnings before 1940, and I'm going to explain that in a moment. Could you please confirm that you're seeing the screen? Because of the way this works, I can't see whether you see it.
Confirmed.
Okay, thank you. So this is the path of wage gaps since 1980. You can see the dark blue line at the top. This is the wage gap of Black men compared to white men. This gap has increased. This is the average hourly wage gap. It's gone from a little over 22% to well over 30% in that time period. If you adjust for education, occupation, education, region of residence, whether they're metro or not, and only look at full-time workers, you see that the gap is 22%. That's the light blue line. For Black women, this is full-time, part-time, everybody. The raw gap has climbed to 19% higher. And then this is the gap for, that's against white women. And then the blue line at the bottom is Black women compared to white women, adjusting for education, occupation, etc. It's important to take note of the light blue line and the red line, sort of the lighter red line, because these control for education. This is the difference in the returns to skill acquisition. So when people think that if we only look at education, if we compensate for educational differences, we will have solved the problem. As you can see, you clearly would not solve the problem. When you look at the wealth gap, what you are looking at is a cumulative function made up of initial wealth holding going back to 1865, the returns to those wealth holdings, plus the returns to the savings from income and from income generated from wealth, savings from the income generated from wealth. So if there's a wage gap, there will be a savings gap. Blacks and whites have virtually the same savings rates. So if you make less money, your aggregate savings will be less because you have less to save from. That gets compounded. So this 31%, or if you prefer to look at it from the viewpoint of a Black man with the same education, living in the same area with the same background, every hour they are 22% behind. Their savings get compounded year after year after year, and that explodes into the wealth gap. So that's why it's important to understand the wage gap. I'm going to show you this slide because I want to take you back a little bit further, because you saw that there was already a gap at the beginning in 1980. If we go back to 1940, you see there is still a gap. The line at the top are white men at the top of the white income distribution. These are those, and these are annual salaries, those who are at the top 10%, the 90th quantile. If you look just below that, these are the top earners for Black men. And you can see the gap. In 1940, at the top, white men made almost twice as much as the highest earning Black men, $40,000 compared to $20,000. For those at the median, these are the blue dashed lines. The blue dashed lines with the triangles are white men at the median. shows more or less the typical person, right? Half below, half above. And then the blue dashed lines with the black dots, these are black men at the median. And you see repeated again this gap. White men at the median were making close to 20,000, black men at the median close to 10,000, roughly twice the amount. You see these lines move pretty much in parallel. There's some gains made for black men at the very high end, but these gaps are moving kind of in parallel. That's because there are structures already built in. And these structures are what you have to interrupt. But these structures and these pay gaps are brought forward because, again, the savings from that time period get compounded into the wealth of today. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples, and I'm going to start with a concentration of an example dealing with actions of the state to create these wage structures. I'm going to give you a concrete example of actions of workers against other workers, and then an example of companies working against workers. I was asked to try and make this a little personal, so I'm going to start with that. This is a picture of my great-great-grandfather. That's the gentleman there at the bottom. This picture was taken in Beggs, Oklahoma. It was at the funeral of my great-great-grandmother. The woman on the far right is my great-grandmother, Matilda Spriggs. The gentleman to her immediate right, the picture going left of her, is going to be important for this story because that's Isaac James, who was a locomotive fireman at the time of this picture. And the gentlewoman who is in front of my great-grandmother on the right, the shorter woman, is Emma James Wade. She's going to be important for this story at the moment that I'm going to talk about. She was a school teacher in Alabama, a certified school teacher in 1899 in Alabama. When we look at the 1940s, this was the occupation teaching of blacks who had college degrees for the most part. Well over half of blacks were teachers if they had a college degree. 76% of blacks with a bachelor's degree were teachers if they lived in the South. 28% of all blacks with a bachelor's degrees were teachers in the South. This is key because it gets to state action. This is discrimination that limited the mobility of educated blacks, the most educated, those with a college degree, before 1940. If we look at what that pay looked like, this is 1940 pay of college graduates. These are sort of major occupations that college graduates had at the time. You will see the red line indicates the pay for teachers. And if you look in the South, you see that white teachers with college degrees were paid about $1,200 a year in 1940, compared to blacks who are paid somewhere close to $760 a year. Outside the South, you see that blacks did better, but that's a clear indication of what's going on here. If blacks could move to the outside of the South as teachers, they gain quite a bit in pay. In fact, they would be paid much more than white college-educated teachers in the South. Why didn't they just move? And this gets to the act of discrimination in hiring black teachers. The primary role of black teachers was to teach black school children in the South. And so they were constrained, they were prevented from taking their skills and their talent across state lines and enjoying their skills. Oddly, the most skilled workers in this scenario didn't migrate. Now, this shows you the distribution of teachers. This is with some college, because in the 1940s, there were still people who had teacher certificates. They didn't require a full bachelor's degree. the black lines represent the black teachers, the red lines represent white teachers. The axis on the top is telling you how many teachers there are for blacks, and the bottom for white teachers. And you can see that blacks are heavily concentrated in the South. This isn't simply because the black population is concentrated in the South. It's because black teachers teach black kids. They are concentrated in the South. You will notice that in the 1940s 1% census, there are no black teachers who appear in the Pacific. This means California, Oregon, and Washington. They are constrained, they are constricted to living and working in the South for the most part. Some advance when you look at the East North Central, which is the Great Lakes, meaning Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, areas that blacks have begun to migrate to. The Middle Atlantic is where we would find New York and areas in New Jersey and Philadelphia. 1950, it starts to spread out a little bit more. We get to see more black teachers spreading out a little bit, but they are still, even by 1950, still highly concentrated. This concentration is the clue to you that blacks are being confined. This is what teacher pay looked like by race and region and by educational attainment. If you look in the South here, we can see it more graphically. You see that whites, this with the blue line is some college, the red line is a bachelor's or more, that whites with some college are approximating the pay that blacks had, even if they had a bachelor's degree when they were teaching. And you see that the pay in the South is much lower than in other regions. Again, another indication that this high concentration of blacks in the South, if they could have moved, if they could have gotten a job outside the South, they would have greatly benefited. They weren't able to. And you see, overall, that's on the far right. This is what, blacks as teachers were paid overall. You see how much heavily influenced it is by the South, nowhere near what the average is for, blacks outside of the South, because, again, the bulk of them are living in the South. So you see this gap. Blacks overrepresented, highly segregated into teaching, paid much less than whites. This is state action. They are being paid by the state less than their counterparts. Now, black people did not sit by. I'm going to include in this presentation lots of issues of black agency. Black people didn't sit by. They figured out how to get education. They figured out how to fight against this. The first case, and this again to make it kind of personal, Aileen Black, who taught at Booker T. Washington High School in Norfolk, Virginia, was my mother's science teacher. Aileen Black volunteered to be the first test case brought by Thurgood Marshall and the team of lawyers from the NAACP. Most of these are Howard University Law School faculty members, to fight for her equal pay. The response of the school board was, you entered into this agreement voluntarily. You knew you were going to get paid less. If you don't want the contract, fine, don't take it. They fired her. Subsequent to Aileen being fired, then another teacher at Booker T. Washington High School stepped up, Melvin Alston, and was the successful case that Thurgood Marshall brought to bring about equal pay for black teachers in the South. And so when we skip to 1950, we see that the pay has become much more equal in the South as a result of litigation that started in the 1930s, hadn't taken full force in the 1940s, but by the 1950s, you see that blacks with a bachelor's degree are paid much more than whites who only had teacher certificates, paid close to what whites were being paid, and that the overall pay for black teachers, that's the yellow line there in the South, is much closer for blacks and whites. Outside the South, you see great success for blacks. They are now outpaid compared to whites who are in teaching. And overall, you see much more equality between blacks and whites in terms of what are teachers being paid. That's because of black agency and fighting against that discrimination. It does not erase the 50 years of history up to that point where there was unequal pay compounded into the savings that generated a wealth gap. And before we get too happy with the idea that, oh, wow, we got equal pay for the teachers, so blacks with college degrees were doing okay compared to whites. You can see from this graph, the blue shades are the pay for whites, the orange shades are the pay for blacks. You see, teaching is not the high paid occupation for people with college degrees. It's being managers. Whites who are managers are paid the most among the people with college degrees, and professionals. These are occupations in which blacks are underrepresented. Again, this sense of being denied access despite educational attainment. So that's important to keep in mind. This is an example of state action, confining blacks to the South, relegating them only to teaching in segregated settings, and even within that setting, having discriminated against them. Blacks fight against that, fight for equal pay. Get it, but this does not equalize the playing field. It only removes one element of that barrier. State enforced is important because that's a contribution of the state to this action. Think about why there weren't black teachers in California in meaningful numbers before 1950. And before you say, well, they weren't there, I'll just remind you, one of the reasons I showed you the picture of my family, well, Emma migrated to California in the 1930s. Her brother, who was on the far left, came to California in the 1930s, a little later. Black people from Oklahoma in particular, after the Tulsa riots, were quick to move to California. Remember that Los Angeles was basically an oil town at the beginning of the 20th century. These were people from oil territory in Oklahoma. And before we get too happy and celebrating about all this equal pay stuff, again, personal, the arrow there is pointing to Lacey Spriggs. That's my uncle. He was the first black principal in the Des Moines school system. This is 1966. And you will see, even though he is, at this point, he had a master's degree and was principal of a junior high school there in Des Moines, he's the lowest paid secondary principal in the city, despite his master's degree. And if you look below there, you will see elementary school principals who are paid more than he's being paid as a junior high principal. About 15 years later, the city standardized the pay for junior and senior high school principals, and this pay disparity disappeared. But it's important to note that even in 1966, this kind of disparity persisted, even outside the South in Des Moines, Iowa. I'm going to talk now about the significance of Isaac James, distant great uncle of mine. In that picture, I told you that he was a fireman. This is the educational attainment of all railroad workers in 1940. You can see it's a job that is readily accessible, even for men at that time, because the bulk of the workers had an 8th grade education or less. This is a middle class job which is benefiting from the technological progress of the era. The change from water power to electricity meant that factories didn't have to be located next to water. Railroads become vitally important. The industrialization means that we need to move lots of goods very quickly. Some not located near water, the railroads become vital. So this is a job which sort of men with typical educational attainment could make a good living. They were early on in the ability to unionize. You see the difference between blacks and whites in terms of educational attainment isn't really that great. The majority of blacks had 8th grade or less. You see that there are some blacks with college or more. There's a little red line, the college or more is on the far right, and you can see that there are blacks in the railroad industry with some college. I'm going to concentrate on these locomotive firemen because it's an occupation that black men were easy to get into, because when they were steam engines, this was a dirty job. This was a filthy job. You're shoveling the coal that keeps the fire going. The steam engines of that era were crude. They could explode. If you didn't have the skill to maintain the steam pressure properly, this was very dangerous work. Plus, it was dirty and grimy. No one wanted it. that's how black men were able to have access to it. You can see that for black men, the pay, the $1,250 a year, was much higher than what black men were getting in other occupations in the railroad industry. For whites, it was about the same, not that much different than what whites outside of the locomotive firemen were getting. And that's again because whites could be engineers, blacks could not. And whites who were in some of the other occupations were still paid more than blacks. You see the average pay for blacks compared to whites. Whites in this industry paid almost twice as much, even though most of these workers have little more than an 8th grade education. In terms of the importance of the industry, you see the big growth in firemen that's taking place. It peaks near 1920 because in the early part of the 20th century, that is when the diesel engine gets introduced. And by the 1920s, the railroad industry is quickly transforming from steam-powered to diesel-powered engines, and the job of fireman totally switches. It goes from a job that nobody wants to a job that everybody wants because they don't actually need somebody to stoke the fire. This is now a clean job. Fireman really means that you're an apprentice to become an engineer. Totally different job. And you see black men receding in numbers, almost disappearing from this occupation after 1920. There's a tick up in the 1940s because the war effort, we had to use every engine we possibly could, and they didn't want all the oil going to engines. They used some of the coal for trains, and so there's a tick up in firemen that takes place during World War II. So that's the spike you see from 1940 to 1950. The black share of railroad firemen, just like with the teachers, highly concentrated in the South. By the peak of the demand for this job in the 1920s, blacks are over 25% of the firemen in the South. But you see, they quickly decline because as the new technology comes in, as the transformation of this job from fireman to apprentice to being an engineer takes place, black men are being chased out. They're able to hold on during the war effort, and that's why you see the slight rise outside the South for blacks taking place in the 1940s. This was the help of the war effort. Now, here's the key. In 1940, you notice there are no black men who are firemen under the age of 33. This is the locking black men out of this occupation. The only people under 33 are white because they are apprentices to become engineers. The black men are left because you can't get rid of all the steam engines. You still have some left, but these black men, oddly, within their labor contracts now have super seniority. And so the result is that within their union contracts, they should be the most favored as firemen. Now, again, this is the educational attainment of people who are firemen. Again, heavily less than 8th grade is the dominant educational attainment. None of the black men here have much more than an 8th grade education. You don't see black men with more than an 8th grade education in this occupation in 1940. If we do the typical thing that economists do, let's look at are these black men being paid fairly, controlling for education and age, age being the experience. You see there's a positive return to age, which is experience. You're getting paid more for your experience. You actually don't get paid more for education. You get paid a lot less for being black. This 32% gap is the similar gap that we're talking about today for black workers. That gap is the same as then in 1940 for this vital occupation. Black men did not take this sitting down. Remember, they have an advantage because they have seniority in those positions as firemen, and they're supposed to get the most desired runs and get paid the most money. They didn't sit down. You see this suit brought by Charles Hamilton Houston, who was famous for getting the Howard Law School into being the fighter for civil rights, bringing this lawsuit on behalf of the black firemen, suing their union for this discrimination and winning. winning an award against the Brotherhood for damages sustained by the plaintiff for not being given his full bargaining position. Agency, agency, agency. We have to remember that it isn't that Black people accepted where they were, they fought constantly. And it's important to note that when you think about what is it that was done wrong, it's not that Black people didn't understand it, that they didn't try to find avenues around it, they fought back. Now, remember I said there were Blacks with college degrees. Where were they? Here they are. This is the education and race of railroad porters, the Pullman porters, the union represented by A. Philip Randolph. And as you can see, Black men with college degrees wanted that job because that was the job that was accessible to them. So it's important to note how the acts of discrimination created these hierarchies that created the gaps that we see in 1940 that then takes off and gets compounded because that structure compounds and compounds each year with that wage gap. What you're looking at right now is a film taken during World War I of the 325th Field Signal Battalion. This was close to 400 Black men who, as you see in this film here, were trained to repair telegraph lines, telephone lines, and something no one in the United States knew how to do, radio. At the dawn of World War I, the United States Army only owned 2 radios. Both of them had been made in Germany. No one in the United States knew how to fix or repair radios. These men were a rare group of men with special skills. They were organized and trained just like their white counterparts. Exact same training, exact same equipment, exact same skill. They go over to World War I to fight, as you just saw. They early on encounter combat. On September 27th, when they get there, Lieutenant Herbert, a Black man who was one of the battalion's lead Black officers, is out on reconnaissance. He gets ahead of his line. The group turns and walks straight into a German machine gun nest. They take out those 2 machine guns. Unfortunately, they lose Corporal Charles Boykin and later Sergeant Henry Moody, the first 2 casualties for the 325th. William G. Herbert from New York enlisted voluntarily in Washington, D.C. Why? Because he was a student at Howard University, where these men were trained in radio technology to prepare them for World War I with a skill that no one else had. You see him here after the war with his war record and his enlistment, and he's still active in New York with the state military. And then he continues with the reserve, the 369th Infantry. Notice here, though, his degree says he has a Doctor of Dentistry from Howard University. He became a dentist. This is important to note. This man who has this rare skill in radio, rare skill in a technology no one else in the United States had, he becomes a dentist. But you will notice in his obituary that he's at the same time a personnel supervisor at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Why? Because he wanted to continue to use his skills in electricity, even though he was being denied the full ability to do that. Another incident takes place with the same troops. Rufus Atwood of the 1st Platoon is in the cellar of a switchboard. Private Edgar White was operating the switchboard. Private Clark, the buzzer phone. Several of the men are standing in the dugout cellar, and suddenly German shells hit their position, and the ceiling and the wall explode. Havoc occurs in the cellar where the switchboard is located. Lieutenant Walker, who is the Black officer there, arrives in time, gets everybody under control. Sergeant Atwood then with the aid of two of the privates who are there, reconnect this switchboard vital to communications while they're being attacked. They reconnect the switchboard while they are under attack with bombs falling around them so deadly that it hits an ammunition dump, and that starts to explode. In the midst of all of this, these men are skilled enough to put their position back together and keep communications going. A little bit about Lieutenant Richard Walker. You see, when he enlisted, he was a student at Fisk University. His father was a railroad postal clerk, high-paying job, $1,400 a year for a black man in 1901. It's a lot of money. His grandfather, Nelson Walker, well, he went to Fisk University because his grandfather, Nelson Walker, helped to found Fisk University. His father-in-law was the U.S. ambassador to Liberia. This is no average person. He goes on after the war. Please note here, he works for the Employment Service, and he helps to place workers out of the state of Massachusetts. During World War II, he's enlisted to help recruit skilled black workers. This is Sergeant Rufus Ballard I spoke of. He won the Bronze Star for the incident I just described. He becomes Kentucky State University's sixth president, the longest serving president in Kentucky State history. But please note what he did. This skilled man in a technology no one knew. What happens to Adolphus Burrell? Well, he ends up being a tailor, a presser for a tailor. This man who knew how to do telephones. Edgar White ends up being a chauffeur in Chicago. He leaves his home state of Kentucky for the opportunity to be a chauffeur, even though he has this rare skill.
Dr.
Let's
Spriggs.
fast forward to 1940. I'm going to wrap up here. 1940, you see what is going on in the telephone industry? No black person is hired who has high school, some college or more. None of those 400 men gets hired by the telephone company. None of those 400 men end up in radio. None of them. The industry ends up being segregated. This is what industry could do. So these barriers are barriers of state effort, barriers of collusion among workers with employers, and the outright exclusion by employers. That's what generates this gap. That's what generates the savings gap that then compounds to the current wealth gap. It's important to keep that in mind.